What I was going to propose is that I outline some of the statements we've made about systems thinking in relation to the program that we're going to be delivering on critical systems thinking and the management of complexity online and to a global audience starting on the 4th of October. The first one, so we rely on business and organizations to efficiently manage the systems we depend on to prosper as individuals and societies. But many don't seem to be up to the job these days. The system thinking capabilities gap we've suggested is a part of the reason for that. And I wonder if that's true to you and based on your experience in the number of different fields in which you've worked across a number of different sectors.
I think it's a fair comment. In back to the mid-2000s, the Australian defence and defence industry did an analysis of its performance in an ability to deliver programs for the Australian Defence Organisation. And interestingly, all the process type simpler projects were fine. It was the complex projects that, where we were having difficulty. So in conjunction with defence industry and governments in the US, Canada and UK, we instigated a piece of work to look at how we can improve our ability to deliver those programs in a better way and indeed manage complexity in a better way. And that doesn't mean just defence programs, it means water in Africa, all those sorts of things. So part of the investment was to establish the world's first executive masters in complex program management. I think the name may have evolved since then, but excitingly for this program, the genesis of that, in fact, the thematic stream for that whole program was systems thinking and Michael Jackson's work. The program has continued since the mid-2000s and has continued to seem to be a benchmark and leader for developing leaders to manage complexity.
To what extent do you see the problem in the sectors you just described, but in other sectors also?
Well, it's not a problem limited to defence. It's it's a whole of government, whole of industry issue. It's about delivering leaders that can better manage complexity, and I think important part of that is embracing systems thinking and recognising also that there are a range of different models that you can apply, and not being slavish towards applying a particular solution, because it really is systems dependent or situationally dependent.
And interestingly, you say embracing complexity. You don't say trying to overcome complexity or fight complexity. Could you just comment on that?
I think, people talk about simplifying complexity. I don't think it's an appropriate sort of way of thinking. We do have complex systems, and we need to be prepared to deal with that ambiguity and uncertainty and survive in that environment. And for my mind, the systems thinking approaches enables a leader to do that.
Few leaders, it seems, are equipped with the skills needed to deal with the messes or wicked problems, which are two words used to describe different types of problems in systems thinking. And we encounter more of those types of problems today than in the past. They rely on management theories, methods, and tools that were designed for an era in which problems were relatively tame. Does that sound true to you as well?
Well, it does. In fact, a lot of the education to 2000 was based on the industrial age. Didn't take account of the increasingly complex environment, wicked problems, swan events, and you could go on. A large part of that is developing leaders to cope in that space. And part of that is giving them the tools to do that. And this is where systems thinking stands up in spades.
It's new tools and methods and ways of thinking that are required.
Yeah. So it's actually about developing an individual leaders thinking. So, for example, it's arguably requires a level of personal development, an evolution of the individual and the way they think. But when we talk about systems thinking, we're giving them a toolbox with which to approach a range of tricky, complex problems.
Ultimately, I think, well, we've made the statement that critical systems thinking acts as a guide to practicing responsible and effective leadership in a complex world. And I think that pretty much summarizes what we've just both agreed. But I wanted to just go through a few points in terms of more specifically why we think it's essential or effective. So we think it's essential for effective strategic thinking, decision-making, planning, and execution. I'm guessing that you would agree. Maybe just also comment on what you think the effectiveness level is at the moment and how much it might be improved by critical system thinking.
For the last 2-3 years, and in fact, prior to the pandemics and the floods and bushfires or wildfires in Australia, I've headed up the Global Access Partners National Resilience Taskforce because we were concerned about the fragility in our country, and the bushfires, floods, and the pandemic has shown that it's not just common to Australia; it's an international issue. And what we've seen is the stovepiping of thinking, people looking at their individual portfolios, their own areas of work, and that clearly demonstrated a need to be able to think differently. I think the Australian Department of Defence and others, with Mike's support, Professor Mike Jackson's support, since the mid-2000s, have been developing leaders to cope in this space. And indeed, we saw the military brought in to support the vaccine rollout in Australia because of their ability to think that way. I think we've got a long way to go in further developing the rest of society. So this program that Professor Jackson's developed on critical systems thinking, I think, is a big step towards supporting the international community to be more resilient.
That's an interesting point, just in terms of transnational problems and the transnational organisations that are trying to deal with those problems. You've obviously got experience in dealing with some of those organisations, and I'm wondering what you think the levels of system thinking capabilities might be in those kinds of organisations that are trying to deal with these complex transnational issues like climate change, for example.
I think if I look at the current impact of the Ukraine war and the pandemic, we've seen a disruption in global supply chains. And we've seen various organisations being able to react and deal with that differently. You can't control things like cost escalations and delays in the delivery systems, but the ability to think systemically and deploy a range of different systems tools, think about how you deal with the consequence of those, has been incredibly important. And it'd be unfair to name names, but various organisations that I'm close to have done better or worse than others. But certainly, systems thinking, the tool that provide, is a way of thinking about that global system.
Yeah, and I guess there's always room for improvement. And from every crisis of the type we're describing, they tend to be different. So there's opportunities to learn from every single crisis that we confront.
I think you're right, and I think this is where the sharing of knowledge, lessons learned, and the experience in deploying various systems thinking methods will be important. So that's the reason I've been quite supportive of being involved with the new institute that Professor Mike Jackson is looking to establish, so being able to share that knowledge.
We're more often needing to make decisions without having all of the facts and therefore being uncertain. But critical system thinking seems to be an effective way of dealing with decision making under uncertainty.
No question. I think living in a very uncertain environment where you're having critical unfolding problems puts a great deal of stress on leaders. If they're not equipped to think about how they can address those emerging complexities or emerging issues, then they're going to end up in a whole world of hurt. So I think the systems thinking approach is a way of preparing leaders to deal with those with the uncertain environment.
But it kind of goes against the normal way of thinking about management, which is trying to achieve certainty. Management generally doesn't like uncertainty, so we've got to embrace it. And maybe this is a new tool for ways to get more comfortable with dealing with uncertainty.
We're only dealing with that aspect of business. I mean, the industrial process approach has a place. Most of the business as usual activities that exist in an organisation do well and improve from effectiveness and an efficiency point of view through improved process. It's when you're dealing with uncertainty and ambiguity and complex unfolding environment that slavish adherence to process will only drive to failure.
To what extent do you think critical systems thinking is important in the management of risk? I mean, all kinds of risk.
I think you're talking one and the same thing when you start to talk about dealing with complexity. It's in effect emerging risk and the management of risk, so they're one and the same thing.
It's also essential in relation to achieving resilience, which is one of your main focuses in the organisation you're working care of today, yeah?
A resilient nation is a connected nation where we look beyond individual portfolios such as health, energy, education, to understand what the flow-on effects are from an event happening in one portfolio and the implications for all the other, and being able to act, from whole of nation approach and understanding what that means for sovereign capability, where you need to invest to better support the nation. So absolutely, resilience is understanding where the risks are, where the fragility lies in your industrial base, in your systems and organisations, and suggesting that you could look at any one of those organisations or systems individually and understand that is complete falsehood. So we just need to understand that a systems approach enables you to bring all that together and improve resilience either at a regional or national level.
Today, a lot of talk about also agility, adaptability, transformation, change, and so on. So I would imagine, well, that's what you're involved in all of the time. So would you agree that system thinking is absolutely central to achieving those kind of objectives, which seem to dominate management thinking time these days?
Yes, I would agree that systems thinking is an important facet of that, but it's also got to be coupled with development of the individual as a leader as well.
Yeah. So there's no point embracing system thinking as an approach if people haven't got the systems thinking capabilities to do that.
You've got to have the leadership capabilities to engage effectively across the organisation or across organisations to deploy and enable those systems thinking models.
Okay, so you're referring to other types of capabilities as well in terms of a different leadership mindset and different way of trying to manage relationships. Is that right?
Absolutely. So you can't effectively deploy these models across organisations and within organisations if you can't engage effectively as a leader.
To what extent is that a problem given dominant approaches to leadership at the moment then?
I don't think there's an issue of a particular dominant type of leadership. I don't think there's been enough focus on the development of leaders in organisations.
Yeah, okay, full stop. A lot of your work is related also to major projects of one kind or another. And critical systems, well, systems thinking generally, critical systems thinking in particular, what role does it play in relation to major projects? I'm guessing you would say that it relates to the issues we've just been describing, because in major projects, there's more complexity, risks are amplified, and so on. Is that correct?
Absolutely. If I go back to my original premise, the reason that the Australian Department of Defence, in collaboration with the US, Canada and the UK, established the world's first executive masters in complex program management with the underpinning thematic of systems thinking was the need to improve our ability to deliver those complex projects, recognising that systems thinking was an important key to that improvement.
It's been said to me that there's more than 10 main schools of systems thinking. That makes it fairly daunting for anybody to try to get into systems thinking. I kind of got into it through critical systems thinking and Mike's approach, which advocates that each one of the systems thinking approaches has strengths and weaknesses depending on the nature of the type of problem you're actually trying to solve. Is that your experience?
You'll quickly drive to failure if you're focusing on one particular model or approach to systems thinking. And that's, I think, what has always drawn me to Mike's work is acknowledgement that it's case sensitive, or situationally sensitive. You need to think about what models are available and what and how you deploy them, depending on that circumstance. And it's great to see the evolution of his work and the broader support for the international community, moving from his original book that I've read on systems thinking, creative holism for managers, through to his new book on which this program's based. And in fact, I've encouraged our own people to enrol, because I think it'll be of extreme value for them.
On that same point, I think most complex problems like these also evolve. They're quite dynamic. So it's also a case of understanding how to apply different approaches as the challenge you're addressing evolves. It's not a case of starting out with one approach and sticking to one approach throughout the whole problem. Is that also true?
Absolutely. So, the complex situations evolve over time, and you have to keep a weather eye for what that means and whether you should continue with the current approach or the extant approach, or you need to shift and adjust. And invariably, you would, if you're dealing with a genuine complex problem, you're going to evolve as the situation evolves.
Systems thinking is a kind of iterative approach to problem solving as well.
Well, yes, most likely an iterative approach in terms of the different models you might use depending on how the circumstance is changing and where you are on a particular timeline.
Well, there were the questions I wanted to just cover in this. So I don't know whether there's anything you wanted to add that you think I should have asked.
No, I think we've got a reasonable coverage there, and as I say, I'm happy to come back and sort of hit on some other things if you feel on reflection that there's some gaps. I think I was very quick to commend the program to others. I think Mike Jackson, Professor Mike Jackson's a global leader, and I'm excited that he's put this program together.